Hello everyone, and welcome to this devlog, which will present to you my game design project. First thing first, I will talk about my initial concept and my different constraints. My gameplay constraint was that the NPC movements have to be discrete, but not the player ones. My idea is so to create a game where the player will have to learn the movement patterns of different enemies while moving freely in a space. My idea is so to create a repeatable game in which the player can reiterate multiple times to find the right patterns, and where he is rewarded every time he discovered one pattern and applied this new knowledge. My time constraint was museum and archaeology. So, my idea is that the player's avatar could be a guard or a thief in a natural science museum. By combining these two ideas, my game design idea is the following: a reverse infiltration game in which the player is a museum guard and has to catch the thieves that are coming into his museum during the night. Every night, which corresponds at a game, a thief will enter in the museum. There is a predetermined amount of different thieves, and one is randomly selected at the beginning of the night. The player will have to learn the different movement patterns of the thieves and try to catch them without being seen. I will now talk about the paper prototype.
As you can see, what I've mainly prepared for this prototype are different maps, but also different movement patterns for the enemies. It's a turn-by-turn prototype in which the game master will have to play each turn by following the constraint of his movement, depending of the thief he has chosen at the beginning of the night. The player, for his part, can move freely on the map. Of course, is limited by his range of movement each turn. Basically, the enemy will play on the enemy map, so the player can't see the enemy movement. The only moment the player can see the enemy movement is at the time at where the player is at 3 cases of the enemy. Also, at the moment as the player is in front of the enemy, is considered as seen. When this is the case, the enemy break his pattern and will go as soon as possible to the closest exit.
Thanks to the playtests, I've seen that these elements have to be implemented in the project. The player has to be in a certain range of the enemy to see him, so he can't see the enemy movement too much and he has to explore the map to discover it. Also, the stolen elements have to be marked, so the player can start to calculate when the thief was at a certain position. Also, the player has to go a bit faster than the thief, but as soon as he's seen, the thief becomes faster than him. I've also learned that all the stealable elements have to be significantly different, so the player can memorize easier what was stolen and at what time. And finally, the player has to have a small amount of time in which he can react when he is seen, without alerting the enemy, or the game can become very frustrating for him. It's now time to talk about my first prototype. In this very unfinished first prototype of my game, we have these elements: a map of the game, three different enemies with their own patterns that are randomly selected at the beginning of the game, different elements that the enemy can steal on the map, a player vision field in which the player can see the enemy, an enemy vision film field thanks which it can detect the player and fly if he sees him, and there is also the possibility of destroying the enemy if we reach his back. But I will still try to improve some elements before the first playtest. For example, I want to add a timer, so the player can notice at what time which event happens, and so it's easier for him to memorize them. Also, I want to create a significantly different items. I also want to make the map bigger and the characters slower, so the game does not finish too fast. I also want to see how I can improve the catching system, so it's not too easy to win from the first game. And I also want to make the enemy fly without going to the player's direction. So I want to implement a system in which the enemy, when he see the players, he will try to go to the closest exit, but which is not in the player direction. In this prototype, I play a guard. As you can see, an element is marked in orange. That means that the enemy passed there. I can try to follow to refine where the enemy is. Here, for example, my game finished because the enemy reached his final position. But if I try to do it again, you can see I can see the enemy at the moment that I'm close at him. But if the enemy see me, he will just go directly to the closest exit. And one last thing, if I try to catch the enemy and I press space, the enemy is destroyed. So let's talk about the changes that I made in my game just before the first playtest. So the first thing that you can see is that I play now with darkness, so the enemy NPC will still appear in my sphere, so the enemy NPC will still play between being visible or not, but plus I also have a game with light, so you don't have this weird effect where the enemy pops from nowhere because it will pop from darkness, so it's more natural for the player. I made the map bigger, so a game is longer. A game is around 1 minute, so 1 minute it's a good time to let the player discover the place and find some elements in the game. You see here after 55 seconds it finished. Plus, also, as you can see, in my level I add a timer, so it's also easier for the player, so now he can say, oh, okay, so if I go there and let's say if I find it, okay, at 15 I saw that that piece was stolen, so I know that with the enemy number 0, which is written on the top right of the screen, at 15 or before he was at this position. And so by seeing that kind of thing, the player can step by step discover, okay, what is the pattern of the enemy. Okay, I know that before 40 seconds he had stolen that dinosaur, for example. And so the last thing I add, but that I will change in a near future, is that, as you can see, when you enter in the collision box of an element of a stealable piece, there is the name of a dinosaur which is written, and it's just a way to help the player to memorize easier what was stolen or not. So here I can see a name. If I go there, I can see another name, etc. And so it's easier for the player to memorize. But maybe I will change it with model that I found, or at least picture that I found, so it will be also easier for the player to memorize them. One last thing I implemented in my game just before the first playtest is a feature in which if I start the game and then imagine that I fail sometimes, so I will just let me lose for the moment, for example. So if I lose there, so I'm seeing it goes to the closest exit, and then I will lose. And if I start again, you will see that now I have a camera in the bottom right corner, And so the idea is to make the game less frustrating for the player. If he fail a lot, he has a small bonus. Hello back everyone. I just finished the first playtest of my game, and now I will talk a little bit about how that playtest happened. So, the first thing that I could remark during that playtest is that, unfortunately, the game is not fun. That game is not fun for multiple reasons. The first is that the explanations aren't clear in the game, so there is someone needed next to the computer, next to the game, to explain what the player is supposed to do. Because without anyone to explain it, the player just does not know what to do. And so, because the game does not explain itself, it will be really frustrating to just being sit in front of something that you don't understand. Also, you don't have feedback on what's happening in the game for the moment. So sometimes you just see that after a moment, your game just finish and you don't know why. Generally, it's because the thief just left the museum, but you don't know that, and so it also can be really frustrating that just you're sat in your level, you haven't seen anyone during 1 minute, and then the game is over and you don't know absolutely why. Also, something that could be really frustrating is that the player um, don't get any reward to win the game. Actually, when he catch the thief, the exact same thing is happening than if, let's say that if he just lost. So in the two cases, if the player lost or if the player win, in the two cases he will go back to the start screen. So the player is not rewarded to catch the enemy. So it's also something that could be frustrating and yeah, not really funny because you don't have to play because you win nothing by playing. Yeah, and so in general the game is really frustrating for the moment. Also the enemy are really fast in the level for the moment. So even if you know the pattern of the enemies, sometimes it's just too difficult to catch them. And then the level finishes too fast. Like for example, uh, in the middle, a game is 1 minute long. So sometimes when you play during 1 minute, you just don't have the time to realize what's happening, and so you just have the feeling that you've lost 1 minute. But there are still some things that are working in that game. First thing first, learning the patterns of the enemies is fun, and the player enjoyed the fact that there were pattern and they had to remember the pattern, and so that was something that really worked. So I really want to keep that. Also, something that is working for to help the gameplay is the fact that you can have a secondary camera to help you after some loss. That is really helpful for the player, and yeah, in general, it's an idea that is really working. So it's something that I want to keep in my game. And also, the player who play tested the game really enjoyed the pressure during the game because they don't want to be cocked. So it's something that I also want to keep. The fact that yes, you have to know the pattern, you're the guard, but you still don't want to be seen. So having a certain pressure that will keep you focused on the game. But there are also other points of improvement in my game. For example, the secondary camera in my game, which is on the bottom right corner, is taking too much space on the screen. And so there is a large place on the screen where the player can't see anything. So it's already something that I have to change. Also, I didn't make the hitbox invisible for my game, so it can be kinda weird for the player to see all the hitboxes. Also, for the moment, the character is looking into the mouse direction and not into its movement direction. So it's also kinda weird to move with that character because basically you don't use the mouse in that game. Also, for the moment, the light is making a circle around the player, which is not really logical. Uh, a guard in a museum will more have a torchlight, so it would be better to give a torchlight effect to the light which comes from the player. And also another thing is the fact that there are the name of the dinosaurs on every items, but it's not readable for the moment. So yeah, for the moment it does not help the player. It's just disturbing because he has to focus like 7 or 8 seconds to understand what the name of the dinosaur is, and so it's a really big loss of time. So the first thing I want to do in my game is to basically change the rules to try to make it more fun and maybe to playtest that new rules not next week, but the week after. So the first thing I want to do is to put multiple thieves on the map. So there will not be only one thief, but there will be multiple thieves, and the player will have to catch them in a certain time. So it could be maybe less frustrating for the player because if the player is seen by one enemy, it's not already lost because it still has other thieves to capture. And on the other hand, it can also be really more funny because the game will be longer because there are multiple thieves on the map. And also, I will make longer patterns for this thief, so it will certainly be longer for the player. Other work that I can do on my game is first I will balance the speed of the enemies. So as I said, the enemies are too fast for the moment, so I have to slow them a little bit. I will also work on the player's light, so as I said, maybe give a torchlight effect instead of a light circle around the player. What I also want to do is to make in the UI, I will make a countdown instead of timer. So the game will finish at the end of the countdown. And so it will be really more readable for the player because since that moment, when the game stops, you will easily see that the game stopped because the countdown is down. When you have a timer, you just see the time and yeah, I don't know, let's say at 54 seconds the game finishes and you don't know why. Here with countdown it will be easier to see. I will also make the names of the dinosaur more readable. I also want to create a scoreboard. So when you capture all the enemy, or even if you didn't capture everything, your score will be registered and you will have a new level, a new menu in which you can check the scoreboard. So you can check all your best scores in the game, and so that will make the game more readable. And I will maybe try to work also on an introduction level so the player can learn the mechanics and the patterns and the inputs easily in an introduction level. I will also make the player look into the movement direction, so its movement will not be weird anymore. I will avoid the visual hitboxes, so the game will be really cleaner to see. I will maybe work on the minimap system also, because the player were sometimes lost in the level, and yeah, it's something I need to think about, because yeah, on the side, the players were lost during the first games. On the other hand, it's something that is cool that they have to learn uh, how their environments look like. So I will still have to think about that. But I had the feedback that being lost in the level was sometimes kinda frustrating. I will also make the secondary camera smaller, so the game will be more visible. And I will also try to add more feedbacks on what's happening. So yeah, for example, when you're seen, you have an effect of on the screen, so you know you're seen. When a thief escapes from the level, you know it. Maybe when you have still 10 seconds, I will make a sound effect, but more feedback so the player can easily know what is happening actually. In that way, with the feedback, well, something that I want to know is activate an icon, maybe on the top of the enemy, and that icon will be activated when the player can kill an enemy. So the player can visually see if he is in the killing hitbox of the enemy. Also, what I want to do is at the end of the level create a screen with all the results. So it could be a kind of a reward for the player if he saw his scores and if he saw that he improved his score comparing to the last time he played. And a last thing I will work on is the fact that I will create a cooldown on the spacebar, because for the moment, if the player is seen by an enemy and the enemy want to reach the closest exit and the closest exit is in the player's direction, the enemy will go into the player's direction, and so if the player is spamming the spacebar, it can just catch the enemy like that, which is really not funny. So maybe I will also work on a cooldown on the spacebar. Hello back everyone. The second playtest session is tomorrow, so it's the time to talk about all the improvements I made on my game. So, first thing first, I created all new rules for my game. So, since now there is no more only one enemy on the map, there are multiple enemies on the map, and the game finishes when the player catch them all or when they went all out the level if they escaped because they see the player. So start from now. The game finishes when there's no more enemies on the map, or when the time is off, because the player has a limited amount of time, which is a counter now, and so the game can also finish when the time is off. I also made multiple levels, so it's a good way for the player to learn the mechanics first before going to the most difficult level, before going to the most difficult level, which will be the real challenge for the player. And then I also made a scoreboard, and that's really in that idea of making a game when you learn and you improve yourself, so you can do a level and redo the level and see your improvement by seeing the scoreboard. I've also added a lot of feedbacks in my game because the player didn't realize what was happening for the moment in the game. So I created multiple visual effects, like for example when the player is seen, the screen starts to flash red. I've also added an interface that give information to the player, and I've also made sound effects, like again, when the player is seen, the enemy will make a small sound, for example. I also added new mechanics in my game, like for example, no, the player has a torchlight, so the light is not surrounding the player anymore, but the player has a light in front of him, which is torchlight, and the player can uh, improve the intensity of the torchlight, but he has a limited amount of energy, so he cannot do that indefinitely. And in that idea, it was to make the game more realistic and make the lightnings in the games more realistic. I've also made other improvements in the game. So I tried to make a cleaner interface. I also tried to avoid the visual hitboxes in the game, and in general, I've made improvement to make the game more readable. So we are in the game. If I start the game, I can select a level. Let's say that I select the level 1. You can see I have an interface now. I have my torchlight that I can activate or deactivate. I lose energy when I activate it. And like if I'm seen by the enemy, there is an alarm, and also the enemy is flying. And then I lose. The game gives me my score, and then I can go to the scoreboard. I can select the level where I want to see my score, and my score appear. I can select other level, but because I just start the game now, there is no score that are stored for the moment there. Hey, welcome back. The second playtest is just over, and after the second playtest, I have some good news. The game is going better. The game is finally at least a little bit fun for the players, and there is a lot of elements that highly increased in quality between the first and the second playtest. So now we have some elements that are really working for the player experience. So the first is the use of a flashlight, because before that there were light that was surrounding the player. With a flashlight, it's more immersive, but also the player has to think about, okay, I have to use my flashlight, I have to take care of my batteries. And that and other things like the light in the scene, etc., help to improve the atmosphere, which was really enjoyable by the players. Also, the playtesters uh, really liked the system of learning the patterns of the enemies, and so having to redo the same level and having to increase their performance. And so, on that idea of increase its own performance, uh, the idea of a scoreboard worked really well. So the players could see their score, could see their performance, and then they want more, and so they more want to replay the game, which was the really first idea of the game. Also, the testers quite enjoyed the base mechanic of the game, which was apparently really original. So that could be a good point also. But there is still a lot of elements that are not working on the game and on which I still have to work. So first, some elements are still unclear. Like, for example, the the items in the level. Uh, if you don't have the designer next to you to say you, okay, when it's green, it has not been stolen, and when it's orange, it has been stolen, it's not really clear that, okay, it's the items that the enemies have to steal. So maybe find a way to make it more clear. Also, the purpose of the game isn't really clear if a designer isn't there to explain it to you. So also it's something on which I can work, knowing, okay, I am the thief because I am the guard, because that first thing was already not really clear. So I am the guard and I have to catch thieves. Maybe I can do it by just showing first video or first animation in which we see a thief that steal an item in the level, and so the player know it. Also, for the moment, the flashlight is not very useful. Actually, the level isn't dark enough to have a full utility of the flashlight. So you can see the same amount of things with or without the flashlight. Also, for the moment, there is a lack of mechanic in my game. Basically, my game has only three things that the player can do. The player can move, the player can attack, and the player can use a flashlight. So we can see to maybe add more complexity in the game, so the different games will not be too repetitive. So I can, for example, add mechanic on the flashlight that could stun enemies, for example. It will be it will already help to diversify the gameplay. Also, Some testers took that the enemies escape too fast, which could be really frustrating. And yeah, the purpose of the game is to learn, but not to frustrate the player. So I will definitely have to work on that. Also, for the moment, the map are too repetitive, uh, so I can work on diversify the maps, and it will definitely serve the gameplay and serve the essential experience doing that, because if all the places on the map are different, it's really easier for you to see where you are on the map and to remember different places on the map. Also, no, some collision hitboxes are unclear, so maybe try to make it clearer, because tester can have the feeling that they are in range to attack, but it is not the case. And lastly, uh, the the testers, could not focus on essential elements in the UI. For the moment, there are maybe too many elements of the UI, or it's not well designed, but so the the tester does not really focus maybe on the timer, on maybe on the stolen item. So maybe have to work on something that make that UI clearer. So what can I do? First, I can maybe add a small particle system to see the range of attack. So visually you see what's your range of attack, but only when you attack, so it's not a hitbox in front of you. Uh, Maybe find a way to make it more clear when an object is stolen. Maybe add a sound effect, or uh, maybe doing something else that only a color swap. Maybe add the timer when it was stolen on the items directly. I don't know. I will work on that definitely. I will also have to add visual elements like walls, etc. on the map, on the different maps. As I said, we could think that it's only visual, but it will serve the essential experience, because the player will differentiate much easier the different parts of the maps, and so it will definitely help him. Also, I can add different mechanics, like for example, as I said before, using a stun that you can enable with the flashlight on the enemies. So yes, let's see what mechanics I can add. I can also try to make the flashlight more useful, because yeah, as I said, for the moment it's not really useful, so maybe play with the light of the level, etc. Maybe change enemies pattern, especially in the first level, so maybe the player can directly start the first level by seeing an enemy steal an item, and so he directly understand, okay, that's an enemy, that's an item, I have to catch it. uh, I also have to find a way to make it possible to catch the enemy even if he saw the player, because for the moment when an enemy sees a player, it's totally impossible for the player to catch the enemy, or at least it's really difficult. But the problem is that could affect the essential experience, which is about learning, and so being patient, etc. And so if you can do mistake and still win the game after that, maybe it will make the game too easy. So I have to work on it, and to see how I can implement it without affecting too much the essential experience. And then yeah, I can also make the UI more readable, because as I said, the player cannot focus on the correct elements for the moment. And I'd still have also some bug to correct, like the timer, which continues and the level don't stop when the timer is over, or the ordering in the different scoreboards, isn't working really well. So it's also definitely something uh, I can work on. I've also made some improvement for my third prototype. So I made visual effects for the attacks of the player. I also upgraded the different UI, the HUD. I improved it. I add some interaction with the HUD. I've also reworked the light, so the light is now more useful in the game. I've also replaced the enemies, especially in the level 1, so now the game is more readable and you can more easily see the purpose of the enemies. I've also added decorative elements in my different levels. I add some walls, so it's easier to see where you are in the level, and I've also corrected some bugs. So first, as you can see, now in my level 1 you can directly see the enemy, and you can directly see that the enemy is turning that place to orange, so it's easier to see what the enemy is doing. Also, I've added another enemy which has a small pattern on the left right here, so you can also easily see that enemies have a pattern and that they are repeating their pattern. I've also added arms to my player, so when I press space, you can visually see the hitbox of my attacks. And as you can see, I've also improved the lights. So now, if, activating the torchlight is really more useful. And yeah, to finish, you can see that now the different interfaces are interacting. So you could have seen for the remaining items, and I will take you back at the end of the timer so you can see the. So you will see in a few seconds the timer. So yeah, as you can see, the timer change, so the player can visually and with the sounds recognize that there is no much time left. So, welcome to the last iteration of my game. So the first thing I did in that last iteration is the fact that I created an introduction level to introduce the player to the new mechanics. I also changed the model of the dinosaurs. I created an arrow that focuses on the last stolen item to help the player to find the last stolen item. I changed a bit the UI to make it more readable, like you can see the L here change of color. So also what you can do is that now I have a light that can slow the enemies. And also there is no more the name of the dinosaur in the levels because I was using text, which was something to avoid. Plus, I remarked that the player weren't reading the names anyway, so having the name of the dinosaur made no sense. I also created a jail, as you can see, so now the player can see that he captured the enemy and he don't kill them because the player were thinking that they were like sneaky assassins. So now they can see that no, they are not assassins, they capture the enemies. And I also changed the pattern of the enemies, so now the player have a longer time of reaction. And the last thing I did is that I made the level smaller, so it's easier to for the player to find his way in the different levels.